Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, thank you for being here today. My name is Arthur Liedekerke, and I'm European Affairs Director at Political Advisory, Rasmussen Global. It's truly a great pleasure to be back at Paris Cyber Summit to discuss crucial topics for our cyber community at large amongst like-minded partners. So thank you to Sébastien and the entire team behind this unique event. It's also a distinct privilege for me to be moderating this Cyber Commanders panel alongside such stellar speakers. Needless to say that Russia's invasion, coupled with its digital onslaught of Ukraine, the growing maturity of other competitors and their aggressive behaviors in cyberspace, the increasing availability of offensive hacking tools, as well as advancements in artificial intelligence and machine learning, to name but a few, have altered our strategic context. So hearing from these senior officials from Estonia, the US, France, all cyber powers in their own right, have them share insights and their experiences and their expertise on how cyberspace can be leveraged to advance strategic interests, have them compare national models and approaches and explore room for improvement as well as avenues for additional cooperation in a multilateral context like the EU and NATO will no doubt help us navigate future challenges. I will make sure that we have a good 15 minutes towards the end for questions, and I'm hoping there will be many of those. But without further ado, let me officially introduce today's panelists. I start with Dr. Emily Goldman to my right. You are a strategist at US Cyber Command, previously a cyber advisor to the Director of Policy Planning at the Department of State. Dr. Goldman had also directed the US Cyber Command National Security Agency Combined Action Group. She was a professor of political science at the University of California for 2 decades and has published widely on strategy and cybersecurity. Le général de division Aymeric Bonnemaison, switching to French, a servi en premier lieu au 4e régiment d'hélicoptères de commandement et de manœuvre avant de rejoindre la brigade de renseignement en 1995. Je vais attendre. Affecté à nouveau à la BR en 2004, puis chef de bureau opération et instruction du 44e régiment de transmission, il est projeté pendant ces années en Afghanistan et en Côte d'Ivoire. Passé par l'OTAN et le commandement du 54e régiment de transmission, il rejoint l'état-major des armées en 2011, nommé officier général commandant de la cyberdéfense en septembre 2022. Il est également auteur de plusieurs articles et co-auteur d'un livre portant sur le cyber. Back to English, Mihkel Tikk is the Deputy Commander of Cyber Command in the Estonian Defence Forces. His main areas of responsibility are cyber and ICT, operations and capability development. Before, he was Director of Cyber Policy and Information Technology Department at the Estonian Ministry of Defence, where he was responsible for development and implementation of cybersecurity policies. He has also coordinated information security management throughout the MOD's area of administration, including the Estonian Defence Forces. Now that we have introduced everybody on stage, let me start with my first question addressed to Dr. Goldman, but this will be addressed to all of our panelists in a compare and contrast type of exercise. How would you say that for the benefit of our audience who may be less familiar with respective models, how would you say the US approaches, understands threats emanating from cyberspace, especially from a military standpoint, and maybe remind us of some of the key tenets, pillars of that approach?
Okay, thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be on this panel, such a distinguished panel. Thank you for that question. I think what I would like to do is at least start with, before explaining how the United States has conceptualized its military operating in cyberspace, some general observations that we have gained through experience, which really has informed our thinking in the evolution of the military's activities in and through cyberspace. So I think the first one that I would lay out there is that cyberspace operations have become a standard tool in diplomacy and competition. Okay, so we've seen in general, I believe, restraint above the armed conflict level, but below that level, it really is a routinization. In a way, it's sort of become normalized. And another way that we think about that behavior below the threshold of armed conflict is really less about specific incidents or intrusions or hacks, and more about nonviolent campaigns, okay? Because any particular activity may not be strategically important, but together, cumulatively over time, it can lead to strategic loss. So it's really this campaigning mindset and thinking about both above and below the threshold of armed conflict. And I think what we can see is that over time, democratic states in particular have been experiencing strategic loss because of this routinization of nonviolent campaigns below armed conflict. Because the entry costs are so low, the potential benefits are so high, this is going to continue. And however we respond or not, we are going to see our adversaries continuing to operate in and through this space. So I think we need to think about, and the US military has thought about, not only how we respond, but how do we thwart that behavior? Okay, and degrade it and disrupt it before it harms our networks and our societies, our economies. The idea that we can deter that behavior, we have seen that really has not been successful. Maybe we can deter catastrophic attacks, but not this ongoing, continuous campaigning. But the good news is we don't have to be passive about this, because I think what we've learned over the past 4 or 5 years is that we and our partners and allies can be active in this space, and it doesn't escalate to armed conflict. Okay, so there's a lot of room for maneuver here to shape that space and to push back on these nonviolent campaigns. So that's one of the key elements, I think, in terms of how the United States thinks about this. And this notion of a campaigning approach is really kind of at the heart of the idea of persistent engagement. We cannot expect that a one-off engagement is going to in any way deter or dissuade malicious actors, okay? Because the benefits are too high and they're cumulative over time. So with those sorts of insights, the question became, how is the U.S. military going to adapt, and how do we think about operating in that space? And I think that what we see is that we need to couple this notion of deterrence of catastrophic attacks with persistent engagement, okay? Continuously operating below the threshold of armed conflict. It's not always offensive. It's not always aggressive. It's really about thwarting adversaries and seizing the initiatives to secure our networks. It's about understanding our vulnerabilities, how they're going to potentially be attacked, and acting many cases through resilience, proactive resilience efforts, what we call anticipatory resilience, in order to take those opportunities away from those malicious actors. So this notion of persistent engagement, of seizing the initiative, of defend forward, really was the pivot that occurred in 2018. One point I just would like to add is that when we think about defend forward, people tend to think about that in a spatial sense, that we're operating in other networks, and we do get invited by partners to do that. But there's a temporal dimension. It's about defending forward in time, okay? It's about thinking about shaping the space, all right, so that we're not reacting, we're not absorbing the attacks, understanding that, at least for militaries in our system, it's really the most advanced persistent threats that we're focused on, the state actors. So that is kind of the notion that I think in terms of how we understand our ability to respond to those continuous operations, that we also have to operate continuously. And the last point that I would make is that the forces that do that, the entities that are doing that, need to really be able to scale. Okay, and they need to be trained, they need to be resourced, and they need to be equipped to operate in this space continuously, okay, in terms of both defensively and offensively. To date, the major entities that can do that are militaries and their intelligence organizations, working closely with the private sector, other members of the interagency, to have a holistic approach to security. But I think the key point is that what militaries can do by defending forward is they can buy time. They can buy time and they can buy space for other elements within governments and in the private sector to really secure networks and to do the hard work of transforming the technology. Okay, so it's about scaling up buying time and transforming technology. So I think that kind of captures how we think about the military fitting within a broader approach of securing in and through cyberspace. Hope I didn't go too long.
No, fantastic. And an excellent start to our discussion. Mihkel, I turn to you maybe for reactions, if you have them, but more specifically, your view as an Estonian official, your distinctive tenets maybe on how you approach cyberspace.
Yes, thank you. It's an honor to be here. It's always great to be in Paris. So obviously we are next to Russia, but in cyberspace, Russia is next to everyone. So our perspective hasn't changed over the last 15, 16 years from 2007, where we have one service, e-service, for example, which saves us 2% of GDP, which is basically a NATO standard defense budget, right? So we are protecting our lifestyle. It's digital signature, actually, the service. So we are protecting our lifestyle in that sense that we could use this digital ecosystem to have all this convenience in our everyday lives. And having a country with 1.3 million inhabitants, it's a luxury to have a big government in that sense. But we have consensus between the military, the private sector, and also the civilian sector from 2007 when we first encountered the attacks. So it was obvious for the private sector that we have to do it together. It's not only government's job. And since then we have built a great ecosystem to kind of defend all of the threats coming against the private sector or against the government. And lately we have witnessed the increase of different DDoS attacks. And again, it's a good example of government and civilian sector cooperation because we were prepared for that. So we saw after President Zelensky was presenting to different parliaments that cyber attacks were part of this. And also we have been watching really closely what's happening in Ukraine, what are the tactics and tools that Russia is using there, kind of, and how to kind of be ready if they kind of want to use that against us. And we have been, in that sense, anticipating the right thing. Also, what Ukraine has taught us is that civil and private sector and government and military cooperation is vital here. So Russia is against industry and against allies of Ukraine there. So this is why the cyber attacks haven't been so successful there. On the other hand, I think 10% of those attacks would count as a crisis in our nations. So they have been really strong there. So our kind of pillars the pillars are the cooperation. Everybody has a role. Estonia is a small country. It's a really pragmatic. And yes, military has the role not only defending their own networks, but also to develop the capability to project effect in information domain or in cyberspace.
Thank you, Mihkel. Mon général, sorry, in French, everyone. Je me tourne vers vous. On a entendu quelques principes clés de l'approche américaine, l'accent mis sur la coopération publique-privée du côté estonien. Pourriez-vous éventuellement également nous rappeler les fondements, les particularités du modèle français, bien évidemment, avec une attention particulière sur le domaine militaire?
Oui, bien sûr. D'abord, je voudrais souligner, pour ceux qui ne l'auraient pas saisi, la qualité du docteur Aymeric Goldman et de Mihkel Tikk dans le domaine cyber, et déjà noter que nous n'en sommes pas à notre première rencontre, on s'est déjà rencontrés, ce qui prouve que déjà dans le cyberespace, on échange beaucoup dans la construction ensemble de notre avenir et de notre sécurité. Dr Aymeric Goldman a parfaitement et réfléchi depuis longtemps sur le sujet et a parfaitement défini effectivement ce qui caractérise, et c'est intéressant de l'entendre parce que parfois nous dans le domaine militaire on a tendance à appliquer des schémas qui sont les schémas d'une guerre conventionnelle à quelque chose qui ne peut pas être de ce registre. Même si j'y reviendrai un petit peu dans la structuration. Et quant à Mihkel Tikk, il témoigne l'Estonie est en gros notre éveilleur de conscience sur la menace cyber en 2007 et qui a derrière généré bien sûr une montée en puissance que je vais un tout petit peu vous détailler. Donc, en tout cas, le cyberespace comme domaine opérationnel pour nous militaires, hein, c'est en 2016, c'est l'OTAN en fait qui l'a défini comme tel, et l'Union européenne en 2018. Pour la France, dès 2007, on avait identifié notre livre blanc, dans la rédaction du livre blanc, puis en 2008 dans sa sortie, les menaces structurelles qui pouvaient peser à partir du cyber sur notre sécurité. Et on a créé en 2009 l'ANSSI, l'Agence nationale de sécurité des systèmes d'information, et puis au sein des armées, pour répondre à la question, un officier général cyber pour s'emparer de ces sujets à l'état-major des armées. Ensuite, de livre blanc en loi de programmation militaire, on est monté en gamme avec un effort assez conséquent pour construire aujourd'hui une capacité qui est arrivée, je dirais, à une première maturité en 2017 avec la création officielle du ComCyber, donc du commandement de la cyberdéfense qui est auprès du chef d'état-major des armées, et avec ça aussi la reconnaissance du cyberespace comme un véritable espace de conflictualité, ce qui pour nous a un sens tout à fait particulier dans la montée en puissance capacitaire que ça peut générer. Le modèle français est assez particulier aussi parce qu'il construit bien la séparation entre le défensif et l'offensif, dans la mesure où le défensif au niveau national est assumé par l'agence nationale, l'ANSSI dont je vous parlais tout à l'heure, qui se place au niveau du Premier ministre, de l'SGDSN, donc niveau Premier ministre, et donc interministériel. Et nous, le ministère des Armées, on a plutôt le glaive, eux ont le bouclier, nous on a le glaive pour le volet plus offensif de cette dimension. Alors ça se traduit comment pour moi comme cyber ? J'ai délégation de l'ANSSI pour être responsable de mes propres réseaux et des réseaux du ministère des Armées, notamment les systèmes d'information, les systèmes de commandement, les systèmes d'armes qui sont essentiels pour préserver la liberté d'action de nos forces. Et puis, tout simplement aussi, je suis responsable des opérations militaires dans le cyberespace pour la France, bien sûr sous la responsabilité du chef d'état-major des armées, et ça veut dire que j'en fais la conception, la planification et la conduite. À ce titre, j'ai 3 domaines de lutte, je le précise parce que tous les pays ne sont pas construits de cette manière, c'est un peu spécifique. J'ai le domaine de la lutte informatique défensive, ça c'est assez classique. La lutte informatique offensive, ça l'est un peu moins ou c'est pas toujours assumé. Et enfin, la lutte informatique d'influence, c'est un volet particulier. Et c'est intéressant pour moi parce que quand on parle de cyberespace et de manœuvre dans le cyberespace, entre ces 3 domaines de lutte, c'est une interaction permanente en réalité à partir d'un support qu'est le cyberespace avec les caractéristiques qui ont été rappelées par le docteur Aymeric Goldman. Donc voilà un petit peu. L'approche après en France, elle est transverse parce qu'il faut se coordonner derrière tout ça, parce qu'il n'y a pas que le ministère des Armées bien sûr qui est menacé, c'est tout le monde. Donc on a un centre de coordination des crises cyber, un C4, qui est présidé par le secrétaire général de la Défense et de la Sécurité nationale et qui nous réunit principalement ministère de l'Intérieur, ministère des Armées et ministère des Affaires étrangères, même s'il peut y avoir d'autres enceintes, et qui nous permet très rapidement d'interagir en cas de crise, de se donner des éléments, de s'alerter et de voir comment on coordonne nos efforts au sein de l'État. Derrière ça, on a aussi, je le précise, une convention avec nos grands industriels de défense parce qu'il faut que les systèmes d'armes que l'on reçoit soient déjà bien protégés. Donc c'est une convention qui date un petit peu maintenant, 2019, sur laquelle on travaille à nouveau pour la remettre à jour avec les 8 principaux maîtres d'œuvre industriels. Et puis les partenariats, j'y reviendrai je pense tout à l'heure sur d'autres questions, mais vous voyez ici, on se connaît déjà. Le partenariat dans ce domaine-là est fondamental. Partenariat national, déjà, il faut réussir à se parler, mais international et partenariat public-privé aussi, sachant que dans les armées, on n'a pas forcément cette culture, comme peuvent l'avoir d'autres pays, de ce partenariat public-privé très très affirmé, très bien lancé. Nous, on doit y travailler encore. C'est pour ça qu'on sort du bois un peu plus, qu'on communique, qu'on échange et qu'on génère beaucoup de rencontres.
Merci beaucoup. So I think this was a very useful, and thank you to our speakers for managing to summarize some of those key aspects in a very short amount of time. Not an easy exercise, but certainly very useful for our baseline understanding of the different national models and approaches. And I'd like to turn to you now, Mihkel, to see, you were mentioning earlier how you've seen a spike recently in attacks, of course, for, I can imagine, a variety of reasons, not least connected to the war in Ukraine, but to see how maybe the digital ecosystem in Estonia, maybe your organization more specifically, has taken steps to adapt to this new threat landscape, this new environment, and as you were also referring to, a decade after Web War I, which Estonia was the target of.
So I would say that the approach hasn't really changed because, like Dr. Goldman says, you have to be persistently engaged in this activity, otherwise you will lose the edge. You have to kind of be there, present all the time. I think the thing that has changed with the spike of attacks has changed the kind of the urgency of how long time it takes to kind of achieve those goals that we set for, I don't know, 26 or something like that. So we are moving with faster pace, definitely, because it is more intensive. Fortunately, most of the attacks are not really sophisticated. It's kind of just projecting some effects, but with little success, let's put it this way. So this hasn't changed, but on the other hand, we are seeing the growth of emerging and disruptive technologies, which kind of bring us another vector, which pushes us right now even more kind of to adapt with this ecosystem. So I would say for us, because in Estonia, the discussion prior to 24th of February was not whether if it's going to happen, the question was how it's going to happen. So we have been prepared for that all the time, so we haven't changed much from that perspective.
Thank you. Dr. Goldman, Mihkel points to elements that stand the test of time, including being persistent, being consistent, but certainly there are inflection points and there are tweaks and to approaches and to strategies along the way. I think it was in October 2022 that the Department of Defense released its US National Defense Strategy. A little later in March 2023 that the White House released its National Cybersecurity Strategy. Could you maybe walk us through some of the implications, some of the noteworthy evolutions that these documents are enacting?
Yeah, thank you. Oh, I'm talking to myself in there. Okay, that was strange. So I think yesterday we had a representative from the National Cyber Director's Office who spoke about our recently released National Cyber Strategy. So I'm not going to repeat what he said, but I mean there was a sense, first of all, that that this strategy really is about rebalancing the relationship and the responsibility and the incentives for securing and placing more of a burden on those that have the ability, the larger entities, and not really relying on individuals and smaller entities to try to deal with this onslaught of activity, this continuous activity. So I think that's one key important point. From a military perspective, one of the pillars talks about disrupting ongoing threats below the threshold of armed conflict. So for those who are outside of the United States, when you sort of read that strategy, you'll see that there is an element that acknowledges the military's role, but it also, we have a forthcoming Department of Defense cyber strategy. It was just signed by our Secretary of Defense. It was sent to Congress, and there should be an unclassified summary coming out shortly. So that's going to provide really a more detailed, holistic view of the military aspect and the defense aspect of it. That strategy, before I sort of make a few comments about that, really builds on what as you said, the released National Defense Strategy. So if you look at our National Defense Strategy, it talks a lot about the concept of integrated deterrence. Many of us know that deterrence has always been integrated, but we're just reinforcing the need to bring together all tools of national power across all domains to be able to deter armed conflict. At the same time, very interestingly, there is a stream of it that talks about campaigning below the threshold of armed conflict. So this is a very interesting, I think, development because it's a recognition that space below armed conflict is strategically important, strategically consequential. And what I mean by that is that adversaries can operate in that space without going to war, and they can shift the international balance of power. Okay, so for example, through massive IP theft, China has been able to dramatically increase the size of its economy and its economic strength and power. So I think it's a very interesting thing for military organizations to begin to think about the fact that you can actually achieve strategic impact without war. Okay, so that's one of the interesting things that we see in the National Defense Strategy. And in terms of the forthcoming DoD cyber strategy, it also builds upon the 2018 DoD cyber strategy, which introduced the concepts of defend forward and persistent engagement. But what it also does is it puts a tremendous emphasis on alliances and partnerships, and basically says that alliances and partnerships are absolutely foundational to the way that we need to operate. And it also acknowledges that competition, crisis, and conflict are different conditions, and we need to think about how to apply cyberspace capabilities in competition, and then what we've learned from Ukraine, how to apply them in conflict. And so as that forthcoming strategy, one of the things that it states up front is it reflects what we have learned from experience, both since 2018, when the military got more authorities to operate in and through cyberspace, and also with the war in Ukraine and what that has taught us. So hopefully that will be unclassified version out sooner rather than later. Thank you.
En général, à entendre les priorités qui sont évoquées par vos homologues, quelles priorités pour le ComCyber aujourd'hui, notamment en vue d'atteindre les objectifs qui sont fixés par la revue nationale stratégique d'une résilience de premier rang, et évidemment cette période charnière qui est l'examen de la loi de programmation militaire à l'Assemblée nationale.
Bien, merci pour cette question qui ne me rend pas trop mal à l'aise parce que c'est un peu mon quotidien depuis un an. Donc la revue nationale stratégique, effectivement, et j'ai ce cadre qui est clair et j'ai cette chance. Elle a été donc rédigée en 2022 et elle nous précise effectivement, alors il y a les objectifs stratégiques dans cette revue nationale stratégique et à la rigueur je me reconnaissais dans chacun de ces objectifs stratégiques, donc ça pouvait me faire peur un peu d'un certain côté, mais c'est aussi un bon ressort pour aller vers la LPM et voir comment on va construire l'action derrière. Donc il y en a deux notamment que je voudrais mentionner parce qu'ils sont assez déterminants pour mes fonctions. C'est celui de la résilience cyber de premier rang, vous l'avez mentionné. Mais il y a aussi la liberté d'action, ça c'est le numéro 4 pour ceux qui suivent la revue nationale stratégique. Et le numéro 10, c'est la liberté d'action et la capacité à conduire des opérations militaires, y compris de haute intensité, dans tous les champs. Et dans tous les champs, vous savez, nous on parle de milieux et de champs, j'y reviendrai tout à l'heure, mais c'est assez important à entendre. Les milieux, c'est terre, air, mer, espace, et maintenant cyber. Et pour les champs, c'est le champ informationnel et le champ électromagnétique. Donc typiquement, quand vous dites ça, 5 milieux, 2 champs, je suis concerné par un milieu complètement et 2 champs par définition. Ensuite, la loi de programmation militaire, donc c'est un travail qu'on a pu construire et on a développé, on a besoin de moyens bien sûr, avant tout, enfin pas avant tout d'ailleurs, mais on a besoin de moyens et d'outils. Et ça, aujourd'hui, j'ai la chance d'avoir été entendu, c'est-à-dire qu'il y a la prise de conscience sur le cyber en France est bien établie et parfaitement établie. Et les efforts qui doivent s'imposer pour faire face à cette menace sont intégrés. Donc je dispose à ce jour, visiblement, d'une enveloppe assez conséquente pour développer ces capacités dans les années à venir. Et je m'en réjouis, même si je suis conscient que les menaces ne font que grandir et que la surface numérique, que ce soit en largeur, mais même en profondeur, dans chacun des systèmes de l'État, dans chacun de vos téléphones, dans même les personnes aujourd'hui, avec tout ce qu'il y a comme capteurs connectés, la tâche sera de plus en plus ardue. Pour ce faire, moi j'ai 3 axes principaux qui peuvent être des défis ou qui peuvent être des priorités, comme vous disiez. Le premier, c'est la RH, les ressources humaines. Si je le décline, et je sais que c'est un problème qui est partagé, public, privé, français et international, c'est d'avoir de la ressource suffisamment qualifiée pour faire face aux besoins qu'exige le cyberespace et la sécurité du cyberespace. Donc j'ai besoin de recruter, j'ai besoin de former dans des cycles plus rapides qu'avant, parce que les gens, et c'est le 3e point, je dois les fidéliser, partent plus tôt. On doit intégrer le fait qu'un jeune qui vient chez nous ne va pas forcément rester 30 ans dans la fonction publique, souvent d'ailleurs à cause des salaires que vous proposez, je le dis à ceux du privé ici. Donc voilà, c'est une compétition un peu difficile pour nous. Nous, on offre d'autres choses, bien sûr. J'ai 1800 types de systèmes à protéger. J'ai une mission en équipe et avec un esprit de corps fort et le service du pays. Donc voilà, il y a plein de vocations fortes. Mais dans la durée, on voit que les gens souhaitent partir. Et cela étant, qu'ils irriguent derrière la société civile qui a aussi besoin de profils ne me perturbe pas plus que ça. À condition qu'il reste suffisamment et que l'investissement de la formation soit rentable. Pour la partie opérationnelle, alors la partie opérationnelle aujourd'hui, nous on est arrivé à un vrai niveau de maturité entre 2017 et 2022. Je salue le travail de mes prédécesseurs. On a un vrai niveau de maturité qui peut être encore un peu artisanal dans certains domaines de lutte, et donc on doit être dans cette phase-là, nous, vers l'industrialisation. On doit être plus massif dans notre capacité à protéger, dans notre capacité à agir en offensif et dans notre capacité d'influence également. Voilà, ça c'est les acteurs forts, on doit démultiplier. Je dois aussi être capable d'intégrer, et vous l'avez vu, le cyberespace à des conditions particulières, pas tout à fait transposables quand même dans les conflits conventionnels, et pourtant, il me faut appuyer les autres milieux en cas de conflit. Et l'exemple ukrainien est assez criant, on l'évoquera peut-être tout à l'heure, mais on a ce qu'on appelle le M2MC, multimilieu, multichamp, je vous l'ai un peu défini. Et donc c'est comment on fait pour bien intégrer notre manœuvre avec les autres armées. C'est ce qu'on a joué dans l'exercice majeur qui était Orion. On a pu le jouer à la fois dans l'espace informationnel, en défensif et en offensif pour le cyber. On a intégré, et vous savez, cette intégration jusqu'au plus petit niveau tactique, ça nécessite une organisation particulière et c'est assez exigeant. Le troisième point, le troisième défi et l'enjeu majeur, mais il a été souligné ici et on en est la preuve sur ce plateau, c'est le partenariat. On ne fera rien sans partenariat, on ne fera rien sans échange, on ne fera rien sans échange technique sur les TTP des adversaires. On doit échanger, on doit partager, on doit être plus fluide. On doit passer d'une logique très culture-renseignement à une culture d'échange rapide pour que chacun se protège. Ça a été initié par les pays ici présents d'ailleurs, sur le cas ukrainien, et ça permet très rapidement de se protéger des attaques qu'on a pu identifier. Et cette dynamique aussi doit aller jusqu'à l'assistance mutuelle. Alors sur un mode qui reste encore pour la France à définir, qu'on a proposé, et il y en a dans plusieurs cadres. Donc on a le cadre de l'Union européenne, sur lequel la France a poussé lors de la présence française de l'Union européenne, ce qu'on appelle un cyberco avec les cybercommandeurs européens. On l'a repris plusieurs fois le temps du lancement. Aujourd'hui, c'est porté par les nations qui prennent la présidence, l'Espagne bientôt et la Belgique ensuite, pour créer ces conditions d'échange, de partage et d'appui mutuel. On a le cadre de l'OTAN. On a le cadre du forum des cybercommandeurs. On en revient, puisque j'étais chez Mihkel, en Estonie, la semaine dernière, pour cet échange. Il y avait 42 cybercommandeurs présents, pour vous dire que ça se structure vraiment, qui ont pu échanger sur ces sujets. Et puis derrière ça, il y a des relations bilatérales plus poussées qui peuvent se construire en fonction des besoins spécifiques que l'on peut avoir, et c'est absolument fondamental. Dernier point, bien sûr, dans cette coopération, je ne l'exclus pas, je l'ai dit en ouverture, mais le partenariat public-privé, et là encore, la guerre en Ukraine et la façon dont les Ukrainiens ont su y faire face dans le domaine cyber nous apprend des choses aussi sur ce qu'on doit construire avec le domaine privé.
Mais du coup, on va rester avec vous, mon général, parce que je voulais justement avoir votre lecture sur les enseignements qu'on peut tirer à ce stade de l'utilisation du rôle de l'arme cyber dans le conflit en Ukraine et peut-être les éléments dont on peut, ou certains dont on doit s'inspirer par rapport au modèle ukrainien.
Bien, je répondrai avec un peu de prudence aussi sur ce que j'en sais et ce que l'on en sait. Vous savez que le cyber est éminemment secret et se passe souvent sous le radar, donc je ne sais pas tout sur ce conflit. Ce que j'en retiens, c'est un enseignement et surtout des confirmations de choses qu'on pressentait pour tous ceux qui sont des acteurs depuis bientôt plus de 10 ans du sujet. C'est tout d'abord la confirmation que c'est bien un espace de conflit et de conflictualité. On a pu à un moment donné, et je l'ai entendu, donc je vous le dis, dire « Oh ben non, c'est une guerre classique, donc il n'y a pas de cyber », parce qu'on ne la voyait pas justement. Et on a bien démontré, et c'était démontré avant le conflit, qu'il y avait quelque chose en cyber. Et que ce qu'il y avait en cyber était très en amont. Et je reviens sur ce qu'a dit tout à l'heure le docteur Goldman. L'échelle de temps n'est pas la même pour le coup, et la profondeur de champ ne doit pas être la même. C'est-à-dire qu'on est quasiment dans un affrontement, une compétition, une contestation permanente dans le domaine cyber. Donc c'est difficile de dire. Elle n'a pas commencé, le conflit cyber en Ukraine n'a pas commencé le 24 février 2022. Il était déjà là avant. Ça a été annoncé tout à l'heure en ouverture. C'était déjà le cas sur les systèmes électriques, sur d'autres systèmes. Donc ça existait déjà. La confirmation aussi, enfin l'enseignement le plus important pour nous du milieu, et je pense que c'est vrai public comme privé, c'est qu'on peut défendre. On a longtemps cru que de toute façon, on n'y arriverait pas, c'était trop compliqué, on ne pourrait pas tenir, c'est tellement vaste à couvrir qu'on n'y arrivera pas. On peut défendre, pas à 100%, mais on peut défendre, et les Ukrainiens nous l'ont démontré, avec l'aide des partenaires, des différents partenaires, avec l'aide du privé. Ils ont réussi à défendre, et ça, c'est un indicateur important. Là, c'est plus une confirmation sur l'attaque. L'attaque est, je vous l'ai dit, très anticipée, pas forcément qu'au moment du conflit, mais elle va s'intensifier nécessairement pour un relais plus opératif et tactique, comme disent les militaires, au moment de l'offensive majeure. À ce moment-là, ça ne s'est pas trop vu, mais il y a eu cette attaque sur Kassat. Ça ne s'est pas trop vu parce que les défenses étaient bien consolidées. Mais c'est là qu'il y a un vrai moment de fragilité. Et c'est là que l'offensif peut peser dans un conflit. Après, il pèse un peu moins parce qu'il doit régénérer son action, être capable de frapper. C'est un petit peu plus compliqué. Le troisième confirmation, elle en vient dans ce que j'ai dit tout à l'heure aussi sur le M2MC, donc multimilieu, multichamp, que nous travaillons dans les armées françaises aujourd'hui. C'est la difficulté d'intégration de cette composante. Et si je vais conduire des effets, que ces effets soient synchronisés avec le terrain, avec la manœuvre terre-air-mer qu'il peut y avoir. Et on voit que c'est une faillite des Russes, en l'occurrence, dans leur attaque. Défaut de synchronisation et de coordination dans leur attaque, et tant mieux pour eux, et tant mieux pour nous. C'est ce qui s'est passé. Voilà, et donc ça vient nous confirmer ces aspects-là, plutôt que les infirmer. Donc tout ça, je le dis avec une certaine modestie, on ne sait pas ce qui continue, tout ça, ça reste sous le radar. Peut-être que d'autres choses sont en cours de préparation et pourraient nous surprendre. Il n'y a pas réellement de victoire à proprement parler. Hein. Je sais qu'on utilise parfois la victoire de la défense. Ce n'est pas une victoire parce que ce n'est pas définitif. Ce n'est pas une victoire parce que c'est surtout une préservation de nos capacités, de notre liberté d'action. Et c'est ça qu'on doit garantir quand on est cybercommandeur.
Merci beaucoup. Dr. Goldman, if you have any reactions or comments to what the General just said, please feel free. But I also wanted to pick your brains as to what we can potentially expect to come out of, and I know this is a crystal ball exercise to a certain extent, but the NATO Vilnius summit. Of course, last year, the Madrid summit saw a communique at the end with some strong language and references to cyber, announcements of a virtual rapid response capability. Is there anything we should be expecting in terms of level of ambition? And of course, again, feel free to comment on the General's remarks concerning early lessons learned from the war in Ukraine.
So I obviously don't have a crystal ball, I really couldn't even begin to anticipate, to predict, but I could say what I think would be an important framing for the summit to think about what they would produce. And I sort of building off the General's comments, we have a lot of experience now. We've got a lot more experience in cyberspace, both in conflict and in competition. And so I would hope that at the summit, they can begin to wrestle really with some of the lessons. I'm not sure they're learned, but I think they're taught. I'm always concerned that lessons are being taught. Now, whether we're actually learning them is another question. So on the one hand, if we think about just sort of the competition space below armed conflict, I think the question there is there's really a lot of fruitful room to think about the question of norms, okay? And I'm of the mind that a norm represents normal behavior, okay? So we do have norms now. They're just not the ones that we want. They're sort of de facto norms based on all of the malicious activity that we have seen that maybe has not gone challenged over time. So while it's important to define what we would like to see, it's also important to think about how we work together with our partners to construct those norms from the bottom up by working in partnership to contest and to push back on the things that we don't think are acceptable, that are outside the bounds of what we would like to see in cyberspace. So I think there's a real rich area of thinking about the construction of norms. This is a deeply contested space. And if we continue to, the notion that we have aspirational norms of responsible state behavior, but we have to act in the space in order to reinforce them, in practice. And then I think on the conflict side, really wrestling with some of the insights that we've got from the early part of the war in Ukraine, and I think one part of that, of course, is the importance of partnership. And particularly with the private sector. But I think we have to be really cautious because Russia made it very easy for the private sector to support Ukraine. I don't think in a conflict potentially with another major actor like China, it's going to be so clear-cut, right? Because, you know, it's not about the private sector having the same interests as the state, it's about alignment. And we have to recognize that private sector actors have their own interests and their own, you know, the requirements that they have to do. So we have to think about how do we align that and how do we do that now? How do we think about doing that now to lay the groundwork for the future? And similarly, the power of information and power for information sharing is another one that came out of Ukraine. But one of the things that we saw is that in cyberspace, when the conflict erupts, it's come as you are, right? You have what you have your accesses, you have your insights. So we need to begin thinking now about how we set the conditions going forward, right? And we learned that we could help Ukraine very rapidly in helping to bolster its networks, but how do we think about working with potential coalition partners in other areas? And we talk about, in the US, our commander talks about setting the theater and setting the globe, which is really thinking about being very resilient and defensive in your warfighting systems and networks and your critical infrastructure, and doing it now, because when conflict hits, you know, you don't have time to do that. So I think those might be, you know, sort of just the mindset change and dealing with experience would be really a welcome contribution.
Absolutely. So, Mihkel, we've heard repeatedly, the importance of partnerships, of defense, of working together, of being prepared. I think it was just a few weeks ago that Locked Shields 2023 concluded in Estonia. So for those who are not familiar, Locked Shields is, I think, the largest live-fire cyber defense exercise organized by NATO's Cyber Defense Center of Excellence out of Tallinn. And of course, it aims to test robustness, resilience on a range of targets, cooperation between different teams, red, blue, allied, on a range of targets, military networks, critical infrastructure. So do you feel that the level of maturity collectively has gone up over the years? Are we more prepared? What could we be looking at doing better? And of course, you know, given the importance, repeated importance that the emphasis on partnerships, maybe some of the recent initiatives that the General also was alluding to in a more EU context, CyberCo, MilCert network, if you could touch on those as avenues for, you know, doing more and better together.
Okay, that's a tough one, but I will start first complimenting Chairman Bonnemaison's lessons identified as the military language from Ukraine. So one of the things which is especially important for smaller nations is that we have understood that private sector is part of military kill chain. So they are part of our decision-making process and speed. So you mentioned KSAT or Viasat, and Starlink kind of substituted that, but also, let's say, Microsoft, other kind of vendors, and now all the cloud services, the big Googles, Amazons, everybody is kind of involved. And it is really vital for Ukraine to have these services. And it's also really vital for us to have these services in the time of crisis. So we have to figure out, at least as a community, how to make sure that we have those services, and that some company will not decide to take a kind of a leave with the entire collective for a few months. The other thing that we have identified is the importance of built-in redundancy, because this is your cyber resilience. So Ukraine's C2 was attacked since January, and the Viasat attack was prior to the invasion. So if you have your orders passed down, then you can wage the war. If not, then you're in a bad position in that sense that it can hamper. And nobody in the military wants to be late to the war, especially if you're on the defensive side. And also I can give you a really good example from Estonia's case, where we had the ID card crisis, where over 2/3 of our ID cards were revoked because of the producer's error. But we had mobile ID and smart ID to kind of cover for that. So redundancy is still really important. We just kind of have to re-emphasize that. And most of the lessons, I agree, come afterwards, because we don't know what were the actual effects that Russians were seeking in the cyberspace, whether they were met or not, and also we don't know exactly what's happening in Ukrainians' cyberspace. We know as much as they share with us, but that's definitely not all. So, are we ready in terms of as an alliance or as a single nation? I think everybody is doing their best. The level of maturity is different across those nations who are participating Glock Shields, and but that's why they are participating. So there are nations who are simply on the same road as we are, but at a very different stage in that sense. And the general also mentioned this competition with the private sector for talent. And it's even harder for them to actually get this talent. And this kind of then they have to rethink their models, how to approach that. Estonia has developed several models for cooperation, kind of how to facilitate military-civil cooperation, how to facilitate military, government, and then critical infrastructure connection. But one thing is the same, we never duplicate anything. So basically we are using different organizations as proxies for the main kind of connectivity, which kind of brings us to your last question. So all these communities are already fortunately there that share information. So the question is how capable are you of actually using this information to protect? I think the information is there. Information sharing, in my opinion, is not the issue anymore. I think kind of the issue is how capable different actors are actually reacting and implementing the measures which are kind of derived from this information. And also kind of, I think what will come out of Vilnius is the same thing that everybody understands, that we need to be faster. And I will borrow Jim Hockenholz, General Hockenholz sentence here, that there is a saying that alone you can go quicker, together you can go further, but our task from Vilnius should be kind of, we should figure out in Vilnius how to go together and faster. So this is kind of the main challenge for us.
So on these very inspiring words, I will now maybe open up for questions from the floor. I see we have one gentleman in the back.
I probably don't need a microphone. I have a booming voice. Oh, translation. Thank you very much. First, thanks to the panel. It was excellent, and I think as timely as it can possibly be. There's an old saying that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Sometimes they distort that and say the friend... No, wait, hold on. Bottom line is very simple. Sometimes the enemy of my enemy is also my enemy. And there's a question that we have to discuss about how to develop security priorities in a transatlantic space. Because, I mean, there's a lot of goodwill between the NATO members and partners, and we're fighting the same cause. But if you look back at time, even a little bit of time, then some countries were having a deeper relationship with Russia. Estonia, for example, has been ringing the alarm bells for decades about Russian nefarious activities, both in cyberspace but also kinetically. And that fell on deaf ears. The United States has been ringing about ISIS and about the digital caliphate for years, and many people didn't want to hear it. So I'm wondering what strategies could be developed to actually, factually, build a bridge in terms of setting the security parameters so that we can actually face these challenges together instead of in this haphazard way. Thank you.
So which of our speakers?
Bon, je peux essayer de répondre en premier, mais sur plusieurs aspects. Alors je voudrais revenir en même temps, ça revient un petit peu, ça reboucle, sur la circulation de l'information. Mihkel disait que la circulation de l'information était faite aujourd'hui et que c'était comment elle était exploitée et rapidement exploitée qui était important. En fait, Oui, mais on en revient à... On a un délai, et plus ça va, plus les cybercriminels ou les APT sont performants et rapides. Donc cet échange doit être rapide, précis, si possible normé pour être immédiatement exploitable dans les systèmes qui nous permettront soit l'hypervision, soit de remettre à jour nos systèmes. Donc ça, c'est une chose. Mais ça veut dire aussi, et le point soulevé est intéressant, c'est que on est partenaire, j'ai pas dit ami, même si on peut l'être personnellement, mais ça veut dire quand même qu'on a, nos pays ont des intérêts. Nos pays respectifs ont des intérêts. Et l'ennemi, ça peut fédérer des coalitions à géométrie variable. Et donc, effectivement, il faut être capable d'interagir et de voir avec qui on veut s'orchestrer. Quand j'ai parlé tout à l'heure de partenariats internationaux, je vous ai cité l'Union européenne, l'OTAN, le Forum des cybercommandeurs, les partenariats bilatéraux, parce que on choisira en gros l'enceinte, j'ai tendance à dire, dans laquelle on va favoriser les échanges en fonction de l'adversaire qu'on aura à affronter. Voilà. Je pourrais presque vous en citer quelques-uns sur lesquels aujourd'hui on est tous d'accord, et donc sur les 42 que nous étions au Forum des cybercommandeurs, ce serait assez facile de se coordonner. Après, sur d'autres sujets, on ira de façon un peu plus prudente. Il y a quand même une inflexion à avoir, c'est ce que je veux marquer pour avoir été officier de renseignement dans une première partie de carrière, c'est que le principe du need to know doit être un peu bousculé dans notre monde par le need to share. Et c'est important d'être capable d'échanger vite, mais ça ne veut pas dire d'échanger tout avec tout le monde.
Do any of our speakers want to react to this?
Great question. Over the years, different people have tried to solve it. I will give you my personal opinion on that. So I think the only way to kind of get to that level or kind of get to where we want to be is first, since we have to be independently ready for everything. We don't know what the kind of the next threat will be. So there will be never like 2007 attacks on Estonia again. It will be a different type of attack, and we have to be able to react. And every nation individually has to do that. Now, if we kind of discuss how we should collectively approach that, then I would say that we should set a kind of a minimum maturity bar. So if you want to be part of the club, if you want to kind of get access to certain, let's say, services or certain information, then you have to prove that you're in this area, you are above this minimum bar, that we can kind of discuss it with you, because it's important. Not sharing everything it doesn't make sense, because you have to understand what you're defending, what are your information requirements. This means that you have to have understanding what's happening in your ecosystem. So this would be my personal kind of proposition how to approach this issue.
And I would just add, sort of building on the answers that have been provided, that I think that at least for a real core element of the partners that have been working together for many years, there is a real deep operational integration and understanding of how we're similar, how we're different, how we may operate differently, but also recognizing those shared objectives. It may not always come out that way sort of in the public domain, but I think there's really long and deep kind of respect and shared approaches. We need to continue to do that, but I'm a little more optimistic than you are.
One thing that would help is if we actually agree what cyber means. This is quite important, because one of the things that has been kind of one of the latest discoveries is that the cyber commands, although we seem to be doing the same thing, we are totally different. So larger nations use cyber commands to project soft power. We don't do that. We are developing our capabilities for self-defense. So there are kind of little kind of differences in our organizations, which actually mean a lot if we kind of try to discuss how to approach the future.
Are there any other questions from the... Yes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this excellent panel, also all the openness. I have a question for Ms. Goldman. So the US is using deployments to other countries, like you mentioned, to build partnerships, but also maybe learn about a threat abroad and build resilience. What role does for example, diplomatic partnerships play before, for example, going there on the ground with cyber command? Because this is, for example, something that Germany is not using yet. And if we are thinking, okay, if we would want to use it, is this something that builds on diplomatic partnerships or mainly military partnerships that already exists? How do you, in the US, go about this? Thank you.
Okay, I think you're asking about the hunt forward operations, right? And so, these were, it's very interesting because these are, for those who haven't heard about them, I mean, essentially working with a partner who requests that Cyber Command come help it sort of clean out its networks, right? Work on certain networks. And all of this is, the partner requests it, the partner identifies the particular networks that they want these hunt operations to occur on, and essentially our cyber teams sit side by side on the keyboard with them going through. So it's really driven by that partner, but it's also driven by an intelligence requirement that the United States has. Okay, that we have, so it has to have an interest that we see that this is important, and we want to, and we have really talked publicly about many of these that we've done, and the one in Ukraine right before the war broke out, our teams were on the ground there. So I think that these are now beginning to evolve in the sense that they also help to leave behind a capacity building capability, right? So you sort of, and in the United States system, the hunt forward operations were very separate from capacity building, and that was simply a function of who's paying for it, where the money comes from, the authorities and the oversight, okay? But what we're seeing is that often by working with partners, then they can ask for these hunt teams, and vice versa. By doing it, we can help build that capacity. So these are, defined by the roles, the responsibilities, and the authorities and the laws of the United States. And I think that there's opportunities for others to learn from us on this, because it's something that emerged out of the 2018 election defense efforts. And it was something, what's so interesting, nobody really thought about. It wasn't like, it was just, this is an idea. And this goes to having these young people who are really creative, working on the keyboards, right? Saying, this would be like an idea that we should try to develop, right? So it really kind of organically came from the teams themselves. So I think that's kind of a background on the hunt forward operations. And we've, it's one of the things that we, to your point about not being able to talk about things, we've been able to talk about those because because it's partner requested, there's a little more openness to it. So hopefully I've answered your question.
Thank you. I think, Mihkel, you also wanted to react?
Yes, we did a hunt forward with US in Estonian MOD networks. We talk about it publicly because they didn't find anything. But I think the important thing is to define why you need this. So for us, I think it was a normal step of in our partnership to do this kind of first combined operation, and we were quite confident in our kind of network's health, but it was a possibility to get a kind of another pair of eyes and to kind of confirm whether we are right or not. There was a lot of, let's say, insecurity in our team as well because of that. But if you develop the goals really well, then it's definitely useful. So our chief of defense said really good that in cyber it's like everybody is looking a black cat in a dark room, and now US came and helped us to look for that, and we didn't find it. So there maybe isn't one. So, but yeah. Question is like whether you have identified the issue that you want to solve with this kind of mission.
If there are no further questions.
Hello, Yann Bouan, Idacto. I have a question regarding the HR. in cyber. So it's difficult to hire, we heard that. But also there's some issues today with, for example, fighter pilots after they leave the army. And I'm guessing this might be also a very big issue for the cyber soldiers, I would say. Once they leave and they go to the industry for much higher paychecks, how do we control what they do, what they share, what they can do? How do we handle this?
Mihkel, go ahead.
I will take the first because I will probably drop a bomb. First of all, we have a conscript army. So that means that we have young men mostly, but also women, for 11 months for specializing in cyber. So this enables us to build a really big community around us. So Estonian Cybercom itself is really small, but if we kind of take account our reserves which are available for us, who are working in the private sector and who have the proper clearances, then this is many times bigger than Cybercommand itself. So we have opted for the version where we are hiring only the people for really kind of mission critical tasks, and in some cases we just can't provide the challenge for a person to ICS, SCADA kind of in our system, but we might need their kind of competence. So we have the cyber reserves, and we have also Cyber Defense League for that to kind of facilitate this. The other thing is that we have made a clear correlation in our salaries with the sector average. It's a bit lower, but it's correlated. So this is kind of unique, and this enables us to kind of keep people as well. But last but not least, the best kind of thing that we have is kind of the mission set, because the salaries are high enough that people are looking to make an impact. So, and in that case, military has a kind of really good offer that they can do stuff with us that they can't do there. So that is an issue and isn't an issue at the same time. So we have approached that, and right now this approach is working really well for us.
Thanks. En général.
Si vous pouvez repréciser votre question sur la partie, c'est sur j'ai cru comprendre qu'il y avait une notion de sensibilité sur la sortie aussi.
Tout à fait. Ma question était plus orientée sur la sortie. On a des difficultés à faire rentrer les gens, mais surtout une fois qu'ils sont sortis, comment est-ce qu'on va les gérer une fois qu'ils sont chez les partenaires et qu'ils vont pouvoir être dans des positions d'influence ou avec des connaissances, je ne sais pas, d'attaques possibles qui vont emmener ailleurs.
Bon, c'est une question qui est aussi traitée dans la LPM, sur un article sur les conditions de départ et en fonction de où partir. C'est assez dur à traiter quand même, parce que si vous dites en amont à vos civils et vos militaires qui rejoignent le ComCyber, vous serez très contraints à la sortie, ça va pénaliser notre recrutement. Donc il faudra le faire intelligemment et se dire qu'est-ce qu'il y a dans ce qu'on fait qui est réellement sensible et ultra sensible. Il faudra aller plutôt sur ces cas particuliers. En l'espèce, c'est plutôt sur l'offensif et sur l'influence. Et là, dans ces cas-là, être en mesure de cadrer, au moins pour un temps, la sortie de l'intéressé. Donc les modalités sont en cours de discussion. Je ne sais pas si c'est encore voté, donc je ne vais pas m'étendre plus. Mais c'est un travail qui est compliqué, parce on a un flux qui va être important d'entrée et de sortie. Si on doit mettre quelqu'un derrière chacun pour surveiller là où il va et ce qu'il va dire, c'est compliqué. Après, il faut quand même être conscient d'une chose, c'est qu'on est dans un monde extrêmement évolutif. Quelqu'un qui sort de chez moi aujourd'hui, dans 1 ou 2 ans, s'il ne s'est pas entretenu par ailleurs et autres, sur les domaines très sensibles, il est censé pas avoir pratiqué, je le rappelle, parce que l'offensif n'est pas ouvert à tout le monde, je le précise au cas où, et sinon il peut se retrouver en prison quand même. Donc il y a quand même un fait que s'il ne pratique pas ou s'il ne sait pas toutes les évolutions, il va vite perdre son savoir. En tout cas, il ne va pas être up-to-date de ce qui se fait à ce jour, quelques mois après, dans notre système. On ne renouvelle pas nos modes d'action, on ne renouvelle pas nos outils, enfin on ne réutilise pas 20 fois les mêmes outils. C'est quelque chose qui est extrêmement évolutif, vous le connaissez, hein, puisque c'est le cas de tous ceux qui travaillent dans ce métier. Mais donc, tout ça pour dire, il y a une date de péremption, en quelque sorte, qui peut arriver finalement assez vite. Mais encore une fois, ça reste un sujet sensible. Mais à trop contraindre, on évitera aussi d'avoir des profils de qualité.
Dr. Goldman, you wanted to react very shortly.
I just want to make like one additional comment that it's a great question. It's not a new problem. I mean, the intelligence community has been dealing with this forever, right? I mean, you try to, figure out, how do you, provide the culture for those individuals. I think the difference is that in many of these, outside of the cyber domain, people would stay in for a very long time. What we're seeing now is they're attracted to go out into the private sector. But we can't view that as a trade-off. We have to view that, I think, as part of their development as an IT specialist and create an opportunity for them to come back into public service, when we are part of this ecosystem. It's not government versus private sector. We've got to be part of this broader cyber ecosystem together and understand our role in that, and how we understand how the workforce moves across it.
Thank you very much. So this concludes our panel. Please, a round of applause for our different speakers today. Thank you very much.